Welcome to the debate. Picture this. You've walked thousands of miles to escape, brutal gang violence. You've braved extreme weather, extortion, just pure exhaustion.
Right. Absolute exhaustion.
Exactly. And you finally reach a safe haven, a sanctuary. But when you step inside, the gates literally lock behind you. You are handed a list of rules, you have a strict curfew, and your every move is watched by guards.
Yeah.
So are you actually safe, or are you just in a different kind of prison?
I mean, that is exactly the contradiction we're looking at today. We tend to imagine migration as this constant forward journey, right? But the lived reality for Central American migrants crossing Mexico operates much more like a series of holding pens.
Holding pens, yeah.
Yeah. The geographic movement is entirely dependent on these periods of intense stillness and rigid constraint.
Today, we're digging into a really fascinating 2019 dissertation by Martha Balaguerro-Corvo called Citizenship in Transit, Perils and Promises of Crossing Mexico. We are focusing on the vast civil society network, so the grassroots shelters, soup kitchens, activists, that has basically stepped up to help these migrants as they move toward the United States.
Right.
And the core question we have to answer is this. Do these sanctuary networks represent a radical emancipatory movement that gives migrants real political power from the ground up? Or do they, unwittingly trap people in a state of confinement and motion, basically reproducing the same carceral control that they are supposedly fighting against?
It's a tough question.
It really is. I will argue that these sanctuary practices are vital oppositional acts that resist state violence and actually forge a new egalitarian political existence for non-citizens.
And I will argue that despite their benevolent intentions, these shelters have increasingly adopted what we'd call a humanitarian model of care that inadvertently replicates the state's punitive power. They enforce a hierarchy that strips migrants of their political agency, turning them from active subjects into docile populations.
Well, let's actually look at what these spaces look like on the ground. Because when I say the word sanctuary, I think it's easy to picture a quiet church basement.
Right, with a few cots set up.
Exactly. But look at Las Patronas. This is a community of rural women in Veracruz who have dedicated their lives to cooking and throwing bags of food and water to migrants who are riding atop moving freight trains.
The famous train, the Beast.
Yes, the Beast. And what makes this so radical is what they do not do. They don't stop the train, they don't demand identification, they don't filter who deserves care based on arbitrary government categories.
Right, like deciding who is a legitimate refugee versus who is an economic migrant.
Exactly. They are just feeding anyone who is hungry. By doing that, they are engaging in what academics call prefigurative politics. Essentially, they are acting as if the world they want, a world with open borders and basic human equality, already exists.
I see.
They bypass the imaginary lines drawn by governments completely. And we see this egalitarian ethos inside the stationary shelters, too. Balaguerro-Corvo talks about these shoulder-to-shoulder encounters.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, in these shelters, citizens like the volunteers and non-citizens, the migrants, sit down together to analyze the structural inequalities they're both facing. It creates a space where migrants exercise citizenship in transit. They claim a right to exist, to have a voice, and to organize politically, entirely outside of the legal bounds of national membership.
I come at it from a slightly different way because, well, we have to contrast that lofty, utopian ideal of sanctuary with the actual lived reality inside those walled-off spaces.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, no one disputes that these shelters fill a massive life-saving gap. The state has failed, cartel violence is rampant, but we really need to look at the daily mechanics of how they operate. You step into these shelters and you aren't just greeted with a warm meal.
Right.
You find locked gates, you find high perimeter fences, you find mandatory curfews, strict behavioral codes, and heavily surveilled dormitories.
But surely those aren't those just practical measures for running a large facility? You have to have some order.
It goes much deeper than logistics. Foucault had this concept called pastoral power. Think of it like a shepherd and their flock.
Okay, a shepherd and a flock.
The shepherd keeps the sheep safe from the wolves, absolutely. But the shepherd also dictates exactly where the sheep can graze, when they sleep, and when they are sheared. That is what is happening in these shelters.
You think the volunteers are acting like shepherds?
Exactly. The workers and volunteers assume the role of the benevolent shepherds, while the migrants are reduced to a docile flock. This dynamic fundamentally forces migrants into a brutal trade-off. They have to surrender their autonomy and their political agency in exchange for bare survival.
That seems like a very dark reading of charity.
It's what the material shows. What you get is a carceral system at the very margins of the state, where the bodies and behaviors of migrants are meticulously policed by their own saviors.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the physical architecture of those spaces. The locked gates and the high fences, they are not born out of some desire to imprison people. They are an absolute protective necessity.
Protection? Sure, but at what cost?
Well, we are talking about a migration corridor that is terrorized by extreme cartel violence, groups like the Zetas, and deeply corrupt state police forces who actively prey on these vulnerable people. Think of it like a walled garden.
A walled garden?
Yes. A walled garden is designed to protect fragile plants from a harsh storm, right? The fences of these shelters are strictly defensive. They create a necessary perimeter for that egalitarianism we talked about to flourish inside.
I'm just not sure a walled garden works here.
Look at a shelter like Incidencia. Inside those defensive walls, you have priests and migrants sitting in a circle for daily meetings before meals. They spend 30 minutes analyzing the systemic forces, the neoliberal capitalism, the enduring authoritarianism, that are actually driving this mass displacement.
Right.
They are actively building a shared political discourse. That internal democracy, that ability to speak freely, is only possible because those high walls keep the violence out.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that walled garden analogy. A walled garden still dictates exactly where and how a plant is allowed to grow.
Well,
The intention behind the walls doesn't change the psychological and physical reality of the enclosure for the people actually living inside it. Let's look at the evidence from the material itself.
okay.
Omar, he's a 23-year-old Honduran man staying at a shelter called Victoria. He explicitly stated, "I feel as if I were in prison." And this wasn't an isolated sentiment.
Well, wait, feeling confined and actually being imprisoned are different things, aren't they?
Are they? When the daily reality is identical. Consider Leon, a 31-year-old gay Guatemalan activist who fled political persecution. He spent 14 months waiting for his asylum claim to process while staying at Shelter Oasis.
Wow, 14 months is a long time.
It is. And when he finally got his papers, his immediate reaction was to celebrate that he had finally finished paying his sentence. That is the exact word he used, condena.
Condena.
Yes. When you are only allowed outside the shelter gates for closely monitored 30-minute runs to the convenience store, and you have to go with a chaperone, the distinction between the defensive perimeter and state detention completely collapses in the mind of the person confined.
I see your point.
They are subjected to the same rigid administration of time and space that they would face in a government lockup.
That is a harsh assessment, though I do acknowledge that the psychological toll of waiting for months in an enclosed space has to be immense. However, we have to look at why those wait times ballooned in the first place.
Because of the bureaucracy?
Because of the state. Since the implementation of the Southern Border Program in Mexico, which heavily militarized all the migration routes, migrants can no longer simply pass through the country in a few days.
That's true. The state did crack down.
Right. The shelters didn't want to become permanent residences. They were forced to transition from temporary way stations to semi-permanent holding spaces because the state bottlenecked the border. Even those monitored convenience store runs you mentioned, those are direct responses to the realities of cartel spotters waiting right outside the gates to kidnap people.
But the mechanism of control goes so far beyond physical gates and cartel spotters. It permeates the entire bureaucracy of the shelter system. This is where the humanitarian model of care truly reveals its disciplinary nature.
How so?
Well, these shelters mediate the migrants' access to state protection, specifically humanitarian visas and refugee status.
Right. They help them navigate the legal system, which is a good thing.
Yes, But let's look at how they do it. The people mediating this process are often privileged university interns completing their mandatory social service for their degrees.
Okay.
These volunteers conduct intense, highly detailed interviews. They extract highly confessional data from the migrants. They dig into trauma, assaults, and deep personal histories.
Wait, so you have 20-something college students who are just doing this for college credit, acting as the gatekeepers for whether a migrant gets to legally survive.
Exactly.
That does seem like a massive power imbalance.
It creates a profound power asymmetry. These young volunteers hold the keys to the database. The process exalts the sacrifice and the expertise of the citizen volunteer, while reducing the migrant to a docile subject who must continuously perform their trauma to prove they are deserving of protection.
Performing trauma. Yeah, that's rough.
It requires them to play the role of the helpless victim. If you are constantly forced to prove how broken you are just to earn a bed and a visa, it fundamentally strips away your political agency.
That's a really interesting point, and I agree. The dynamic in those interview rooms must be incredibly fraught. But I would frame it differently.
Go ahead.
The extraction of that data, while uncomfortable and invasive, is literally the legal mechanism required by the state to grant the visas that allow these individuals to survive. The shelters are navigating a deeply flawed legal apparatus to save lives.
But they are still the ones doing the extraction.
True, but more importantly, I strongly contest the idea that the shelter system reduces migrants to docile victims, stripped of their agency. We have to look at the historical trajectory of these networks. These exact same sanctuary spaces have birthed some of the most massive, radical political actions we've seen in the region.
You're talking about the caravans.
Yes, the Via Crucis caravans in 2018 and 2019. If the shelters are merely apparatuses that strip migrants of their agency, how do you account for the caravanization of the migrant movement?
Well,
We saw tens of thousands of migrants autonomously organize, step out of the shadows, and demand free transit in the public sphere. Those movements were incubated within this civil society network. That doesn't look like a docile flock. That looks like people who have claimed their rights as political subjects.
The caravans are undeniably powerful, I give you that. But I argue they succeed in spite of the humanitarian model, not because of it. In fact, if you look at the true autonomous caravans of 2018 and 2019, they were frequently condemned by some of the most prominent shelter directors.
Wait, really? Why would the directors condemn a movement demanding migrant rights?
Because they felt they were losing control over what they call the population, which, by the way, is a deeply telling aggregate clinical term they use to describe the migrants.
The population. Right.
Yeah. The pastoral power dynamic requires the flock to be manageable. When the flock decides to lead itself, the shepherds panic. And if you look inside the day-to-day operations of the shelters, this refusal to share actual institutional authority with the migrants is deeply entrenched.
Even in places like Las Patronas?
Yes, even at Las Patronas, which we both agree is one of the more radical, egalitarian spaces, there is a strict hierarchy.
How so?
The text mentions Norma, one of the leaders of Las Patronas. She explicitly talked about an Honduran migrant named Alex, who lived with them permanently.
Okay.
They loved him. They trusted him deeply with the physical labor of the shelter. Yet, they categorically refused to let him handle the intake registration of new migrants. Norma stated plainly, it has to be one of the women.
I think Norma's hesitation there was likely practical, though. It was probably based on the volatile dynamics of traumatized people arriving from conflicting regions, rather than a malicious hoarding of power.
You think it's just about order?
It's about maintaining order in a highly precarious, chaotic environment.
But order built on whose terms?
She justified it by saying Central Americans have rivalries and conflicts, basically implying they lack the objective, dispassionate capacity to administer authority.
Ah, I see what you mean.
That is the very essence of a pastoral hierarchy, the absolute refusal to share structural power with the very people you are supposedly empowering. You can do the heavy lifting, but you cannot hold the clipboard.
I hear that. It's definitely a paternalistic reflex. But again, you're looking at ordinary people trying to manage hundreds of traumatized individuals arriving at their doors daily. But to really understand how restrictive these taxonomies of order are, we have to look at the most marginalized individuals within the migrant population.
We have to look at the intersectional experiences of chicas trans women navigating the system.
Oh, definitely.
Their experiences expose the absolute starkest limits of the sanctuary model. Shelters enforce strict gender segregation to maintain order, but in doing so, they actively reproduce structural violence.
You're referring to how the shelters physically separate the populations into different dorms.
Yes. Take the story of Rosario. She arrives at a shelter seeking safety from horrific violence on the road. And how is she accommodated? She is isolated in a small camping tent set up outside the female dormitories.
A tent? Outside?
Yes. The shelter staff framed this as being for her protection, where they argued that the broader migrant population wasn't ready for trans women to be integrated.
Wow.
Or consider Natalia, who fled lethal gang violence in Honduras. She arrives at a shelter only to find that the infantilizing rules, the rigid curfews, and the absolute loss of economic autonomy felt functionally identical to the extreme precarity of her childhood homelessness. She explicitly said, "I feel that I'm now living the same as what I lived when I was a child."
That's... wow. So the very place designed to save her feels exactly like the perilous street she is fleeing. That completely upends our traditional view of what a sanctuary is supposed to be.
Exactly. When a sanctuary feels identical to the streets, the model is fundamentally failing. The shelter's rigid categorizations of bodies directly mirror the state's policing of borders. They are deciding who fits where, who is legitimate, and who must be kept on the margins.
That is a very compelling argument, but have you considered that these are logistical struggles within a highly constrained, evolving environment, rather than an intentional carceral project?
Go on.
The infrastructure of these rural shelters simply wasn't built for the diverse populations they are now serving. Think of it like a medical triage tent in a war zone.
A triage tent.
Yeah, it's chaotic. The rules are harsh, people are sleeping on cots, and the conditions can feel draconian. But you wouldn't call a triage tent a prison. You'd call it a desperate emergency measure.
Right. But what happens when you're stuck in that triage tent for 14 months?
The problem is the duration, absolutely. But look at what happens inside that triage tent over time. The community inside the shelter actively debates and fights against these very inequalities.
How so?
Balaguerra Corvo notes that at Shelter Victoria, the citizen volunteers themselves actively went on strike against the religious leadership of the shelter. They demanded that the trans women who had been relegated to sleeping in an old lavatory be allowed to share the main rooms with cisgender women.
Right, that strike did happen.
And just think about what that represents. That is a living democratic negotiation of difference. The rules are imperfect, and the gendered challenges are incredibly real and painful. But the fact that there is internal conflict, volunteers fighting the administration over trans rights, proves that this is not a static carceral state.
It proves there's pushback, sure.
It is an evolving space where equality is being actively fought for and negotiated. That is a stark contrast to the absolute, unyielding, and lethal mandates of state border enforcement. I mean, you can't strike against a Border Patrol agent. You can strike against the shelter director.
A triage unit is a useful analogy, but again, when a temporary measure turns into a 14-month wait for a visa, the triage protocols become mechanisms of permanent control.
I see that.
The strike by the volunteers is a beautiful moment of solidarity, I completely agree, but the fact that the strike was necessary and the fact that the administration initially responded by saying, the population is not ready for those changes, shows how deeply ingrained the paternalism is.
Yeah, they project their own conservatism.
Exactly. The administration projects its own conservative resistance onto the migrants themselves. And we must remember who went on strike.
Well, the volunteers.
Yes. It is the citizen volunteers who have the power to strike without facing deportation. The trans women relegated to the tent or the disused lavatory do not have that structural leverage. They rely entirely on the benevolence of their citizen allies to advocate for them.
Right.
That is the definition of precarious dependency. You are only as safe as your loudest citizen proxy.
But that dependency is imposed by the nation-state, not by the shelter. The state is the entity that criminalizes their movement, denies them the right to work, and subjects them to deportation if they speak out.
But the shelter enforces the rules.
The shelter is merely the buffer preventing total annihilation. I'm just not convinced by the line of reasoning that equates the shelter's protective rules with the state's punitive laws. When the shelter restricts movement, it is literally to prevent people from being kidnapped by the Zetas. When the state restricts movement, it is to punish and expel. The intent fundamentally alters the nature of the space.
Intent doesn't neutralize power effects, though. We have to look at the outcomes on the human psyche. When a shelter forbids adult women from wearing shorts because it might provoke the male population, which is a real rule enforced at a shelter in Tapachula, ostensibly to protect trans and cis women, it is employing the exact same logic of patriarchal policing that these women are fleeing.
Right, blaming the victim.
Yes, it blames the vulnerable body for the potential violence of others. And when we look at the administration of these spaces overall, the physical segregation, the extraction of confessional narratives to determine worthiness for humanitarian aid, the curfews, we are looking at the mechanics of a punitive society.
A punitive society.
The carceral net has simply expanded. It's moved beyond official government detention centers and prisons, and it has seeped into civil society. Confinement is no longer an event that happens when you are arrested. It is an ongoing atmospheric condition of the migrants' daily existence.
I agree that the power dynamics are incredibly fraught, and the wait times distort the original purpose of these spaces. But I want to bring us back to the core concept of prefigurative politics.
Okay.
When Las Patronas hand a plate of hot food to a passing stranger without asking for their papers, or when volunteers and migrants sit shoulder to shoulder in Incidencia to critique the systemic violence of their world, they are keeping an egalitarian ethos alive in the darkest of circumstances.
They are trying, yes.
Yes, it is imperfect. Yes, there are entrenched hierarchies. But they are actively practicing a form of transnational citizenship. They are claiming a right to exist, to speak, and to be cared for outside the rigid paradigm of the nation-state. In an era where the state has completely abdicated its responsibility to protect human life, these sanctuary spaces, despite their immense logistical flaws and internal contradictions, remain radical sites of opposition. They are actively negotiating what it means to belong to a global community.
I hear the hope in that, but I think we must critically examine the unintended consequences of that benevolence. We cannot let the moral urgency of the crisis blind us to the power structures being replicated on the ground.
We have to be realistic, true.
Right. The daily reality of these shelters, the curfews, the gatekeeping, the infantilization, the strict regulation of bodies and space, it proves that carceral sovereignty can extend far beyond the state apparatus. It inadvertently traps migrants in a state of confinement in motion. They are governed by the pastoral power of their protectors, forced to trade their autonomy for a cot and a meal. We have to demand a model of solidarity that does not require the marginalized to perform docility in order to survive.
I think this is a point where we actually find a profound convergence, even within our disagreement. We both recognize that the traditional framework of the nation-state, with its rigid borders and arbitrary categories of citizenship, has utterly failed these vulnerable populations.
Oh, absolutely. The state has completely abandoned them. And the civil society response, flawed as it may be, is both massive and essential to preventing an even greater loss of life. If these shelters closed tomorrow, the humanitarian catastrophe would be unfathomable.
Exactly. Our core disagreement remains on the underlying nature of that response. Does the current shelter model fundamentally subvert state control by insisting on the value of unauthorized human life? Or does it subtly internalize and replicate the state's disciplinary tactics through its administration of care?
It forces us to look closely at the gap between the utopian promises of sanctuary and the perilous, often restrictive realities of transit migration. We want it to be a pure haven, but the reality is deeply compromised.
It is. And exploring that gap invites a much deeper reading of the source material and the raw complexity of human migration. It challenges us to look beyond the simple binary of victim and savior.
Definitely.
When we think back to that paradox of movement and stillness, of people in transit who are functionally confined for months at a time, we have to ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to move freely in this world? And who ultimately gets to define the boundaries of that freedom? That is something for all of us to consider.